Thanks, Geoff. And I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and all the countries from which we come, and the leaders and custodians of knowledge, past, present and emerging. I'm going to recap, for starters, something that's Bernie addressed, which is the biosecurity aspect of this, and just to stress that Australia's response to myrtle rust, for better or worse, is going to shape our capability to deal with further incoming biosecurity threats to the environment. Pardon me. Bertie mentioned the EPAL list that was adopted in 2020, which in the plant pathogens category has 6 top threats yet to arrive, one of which is other strains of myrtle rust. The awareness of the EPAL list, I would suggest, is very poor in the environment sector. Word has not got around about it. There haven't been training and orientation programs rolled out in the various environment agencies or the non-government sector, and that's something we really do need to remedy if we wish to recruit people into a vigilance approach to the EPAL list. We have the one strain of myrtle rust at the moment, and mention has been made already of the other strains around the country, and I'll return to that a bit later on. Much of the effort, if you like, in Australia in recent years, because we found in the period 2012 to 2016 we weren't getting traction on the issue, and there was an actual failure of handover from the very vigorous and good early response to the incursion, largely led by the primary industry agencies. There wasn't a pickup by other sectors, particularly the environmental agencies, after that period. And to try and address that, the myrtle rust community of concern and practice from 2016 on put a lot of effort into developing a myrtle rust national plan of action. Auntie Joan spoke earlier about respect for country means taking responsibility for country, and this National Action Plan was an attempt by the community of practice to do that in the absence of it happening from elsewhere. It represents a consensus framework on what we need to do. It recognises that for the species in crash decline, there are very few conservation options, and primarily ones relating to ex situ conservation. This National Action Plan hasn't been formally adopted by any government, and major elements of it remain unfunded, certainly not funded as an integrated whole, but it has had an influence in that it has presented a united consensus view to governments, to funding agencies and to practitioners around the country who are getting interested in myrtle rust. Some agencies have adopted elements of it and are using them in developing operational plans. Funding agencies have increasingly, and partly as a result of the existence of this plan, have recognised myrtle rust as one of the criteria for applications and eligibility for the projects that they fund. And most Australian researchers are at least giving it a nod in terms of putting their own work into a broader context. The Commonwealth is currently translating large elements of this National Action Plan into a legislative instrument called a Threat Abatement Plan under our national biodiversity legislation, the EPBC Act. A TAP, however, will not be automatically funded, a TAP being the Threat Abatement Plan. That will not be automatically funded, nor will it necessarily include all elements of the National Action Plan, and certainly not all elements of the work that's going on that's represented in this room and beyond. It will focus on the biodiversity conservation aspects, particularly as they relate to Commonwealth responsibilities. One of the points that we find ourselves continually having to make is that a threat abatement plan and any other instruments for addressing myrtle rust and its environmental effects in Australia need to address it as a key threatening process and need to look at the whole full range of species that are affected by it, regardless of their current status as legislatively listed as threatened or not. The listing process, as Geoff mentioned, lags well behind the reality of decline in the wild. But the key messages of the National Action Plan, and this is the strongest point which I think it has been able to achieve some traction on, is that a conservation response is feasible, because that was questioned for a long time in the bureaucracies. And it is making the point, which we have not yet succeeded in selling, that a conservation response needs a degree of investment, continuity and focus that is rarely applied to environmental investment, although it is common in the agricultural sphere. Just as a very quick overview, and I won't dwell on it, the National Action Plan has two overarching objectives. One is to establish momentum, funding and leadership, and we've made some progress in that area. We're certainly not there yet. And the second one is a set of themes about impact assessment, setting a framework for species and ecosystem recovery, and learning the lessons of myrtle rust for biosecurity. And there's a priority list which is under revision at the moment and needs to remain so, of species currently numbering 49. Now, turning to the species, we've got basically four scenarios for how species are being affected in Australia. Obviously, many myrtaceae occur in climatic zones where myrtle rust is not an issue, so we're leaving them out of the equation. But within the climatic zone where myrtle rust can or is having its effects, there are some species which are simply apparently not affected at all. So Lophostemen confertus, brushbox, rainforest tree, fully in the zone, but no infections recorded. We'd love to know why. So no immediate concern there. Then there's a set of eucalypts and other myrtaceae which do get infected, but at a pretty low level, at least on the life stages which have been documented so far. We're not so sure about cohort recruiting seedlings. And the effects are fairly minimal. Impacts are apparently low. So you might ask, what are the management prescriptions for that sort of scenario? Well, ideally, we'd be monitoring what's going on ecologically and genetically. We'd be making some precautionary germplasm collections in case we do need them later on. And we'd be looking for more subtle effects of myrtle rust on those species. In practice, we've not had the luxury, the money, the expertise, the people to really put any time into that category at all. The middle column represents category 3, which is species which are getting hit hard, but variably so. They've got some level of resistance or rust tolerance, either between populations or within populations or both. The example par excellence is Melaleuca quinquenervia, which is an absolutely fundamental ecological component of riparian margins and freshwater wetlands up and down the east coast. Nothing much else can take its place if it drops out, so it's a very significant example. Here we know that there is a range of responses, as Geoff has mentioned, to the pathogen, and the management options are pretty much the same, but more so. We need precautionary germplasm collections, no maybes about it in this case. We need to track what's going on, and we need to be prepared to reinforce populations with rust-tolerant lineages where necessary. But it's a category 4 species where the most immediate emergency concern has focused, and that's the species in precipitate decline, in which there is little or rare or no, in some cases, apparent resistance, although there's always going to be some if we look hard enough. I think Richard's going to talk about that in his talks later in the conference. We've got quite a number of species in this category, and the germplasm salvage option here has been a matter of salvaging what's left because we're not going to be able to get it within a couple of years. The window of opportunity for action remains open for these category 4 species for a little longer, but not too long. The option of preference as represented in the National Action Plan is, of course, to have a coordinated, well-funded and long to medium term program for species recovery. involving germplasm capture, extended periods of ex situ custody, resistance selection and breeding back into wild genotypes that can be safely, ecologically and culturally safely reintroduced into the wild. And we are having the beginnings of that with a bare few species at the moment. The key question, of course, is this option realistic? Is there resistance in the species? Can they be selected? Can it be bred? And we know that, in fact, yes, it is possible. There are plenty of examples, including for this same pathogen in South America, eucalypt rust, an expression of this same pathogen, probably resulting in most cases from a different strain from the one we've got at the moment, has been a major economic impactor. And the plantation eucalypt industry over there has been breeding for resistance to it for a long time, successfully. With lemon myrtle, as Geoff mentioned, we know there's expressions of more tolerance from some provenances in that species, which can be deployed. And in Melaleuca quinquenervia, as the graph shows, there's a range of seedling susceptibilities to work with. So yes, selection of resistance traits is feasible, but we face challenges in the conservation area that, of course, these industry sectors don't face. We don't have the commercial imperatives or the commercial investment to drive things. We've got to secure that from other sources. We've got to avoid genetic bottlenecking. We've got to maintain ecological fidelity to what we're doing. And there are relatively few global models, although one of the really big things about this conference is that we're going to hear a lot about what global models do exist, and we're going to be able to learn from them. Schematically, the process looks like this, with securing wild germplasm, preferably not in the kind of mad emergency scramble that we've had to do for 4 or 5 species so far. It'd be nice to get ahead of the curve on that, and to identify both in the wild and in cultivation any lineages that do exhibit any signs of resistance traits, while securing long-term funding and cultural licences, social licences to perform the work of screening, breeding, selection and eventually reintroduction. Now, progress has been steady but slow. A lot of the problems are not technical, they are human, they are cultural, they are bureaucratic, and they're to do with the mindset that one needs to inculcate for success for a threatening process of this sort, which is unusual. It's not a threat process that the conservation agencies or sector have really encountered very often before. There are things we can do, and this is part of taking responsibility. These 3 points, I guess, are certainly not exclusive. There are others. But if there's been one problem that has really been a major one for us over the last 13 years, it's communication. We in Australia, with the federal system and government, among other problems, have had really substantial siloing issues between jurisdictions, between departments, between disciplines, and we have to communicate constantly and effectively across those boundaries. So it's a matter of not assuming that your normal circle of knowledge in your research area or area of practice, whatever it might be, are the only people who need to know what you know. Reach out, get knowledge moving across the silo boundaries. Secondly, we've got to sing the same song to governments, and that is not necessarily a straightforward thing to do, particularly when you're working on different research projects which governments have different expectations of. They expect you to sing the song they want to hear. So you've got to kind of weave your own melody into what you're reporting and what you're applying for. And we've got to think collaboratively. We all do this normally as part of our own practice, whether it's in the research area or on the applied side. But we've got to think about collaboration at broader levels across those silos that I mentioned before, if we're to really have a unified national response within Australia. I just want to go back to the opening shot of my talk, because I should have mentioned it at the time but didn't. And that's because it's disappeared. Never mind. There was a shot there of a stand of Rhodomyrtus sidioides native guava up on the mid-north coast of New South Wales in 2019, with a whole lot of standing and fallen stems of adult plants that have been killed since 2012 by myrtle rust. It's got distinctive white bark, and in 2019 there was still a lot of these standing or lying on the forest floor all up the New South Wales and Queensland coast, and you could recognise them from the bark. And coming up through that stand were little suckers, about yay high, and they were suckers coming up from surviving root systems of those dead adults. Now that species basically has been wiped out in the wild. There are effectively no adults left anywhere. Maybe one or two examples, but that's all there is. And if it were not for the fortuitous fact that that species produces these fields of suckers annually, and they are turning over just enough productivity to keep the root systems going, although for how much longer is a very open question. We think they're declining pretty fast now. Before they get knocked off by myrtle rust, these suckers put enough energy into the root system to turn it over for another year. And if it were not for that fortuitous fact, this species would already be extinct in the wild, and we would have left it too late to collect germplasm from it for any kind of recovery work. So that's the kind of narrow margin we're working on for these worst affected species. A fortuitous effect of the biology of that species has meant that we have been able to salvage germplasm to work with. But it was a near thing, and it doesn't apply to all species. So I guess those are my key messages. Thanks.